Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Beyond the Org Chart, How Restructuring Impacts Your People. I'm Abby Mood, Marketing Director at Velocity Advisory Group. I'm joined by two amazing speakers that I will introduce in just a moment. But if you could drop in the chat and just say hi, where you're from, so we can get an idea of where everybody is, that would be awesome. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, there will be a Q&A period at the end. So I'll just be keeping track of questions as we go along, and then we'll send those questions to Diamond and Dave at the end. Yeah, if you have any other questions or you need anything else, feel free to drop it in the chat. I'll be monitoring that. And so today we're here. We're here to talk about something that is both emotionally charged and strategically critical: how to support and re-engage employees after a restructuring when the organization itself might be grappling with uncertainty and grief and need a reset. So Diamond and Dave are going to go through how restructuring impacts morale, engagement, and psychological safety, common leadership missteps and transitions, which you hope never happens, but of course it's inevitable. Transition best practices, the role of transparency, communication, and manager readiness, getting back to the new normal. So practical strategies to protect culture and re-energize your teams, and then why employee experience is strategic, not optional. So it's going to be a fantastic presentation. I'm really excited. And then our two hosts, our two speakers, we have Diamond Lewis. She's a senior organizational development advisor in Velocity's business advisory department. Diamond supports organizations, teams, and individuals to perform their best through her expertise in organizational development, leadership development design, and facilitation and capability building design. So with Velocity, she works closely with executive teams and HR leaders who are navigating these types of cultural and structural changes, especially, especially during periods of transition like mergers, downsizing, or reorgs, which we are experiencing a lot of in the last year or so. And then we have Dave. Dave Schlosser is a senior advisor in our data and analytics department at Velocity. His role is to leverage his analytical skills and doctorate in strategic management. So we have a doctor amongst us, everyone. He helps clients achieve their business goals and is passionate about turning complex data into strategic recommendations and insights that align with client needs. So after all that, like I said, if you have any questions, drop them in the chat, but I will hand it over to our experts to run the show, and then I'll be back at the end.
All right. Thank you so much for that intro, Abby. Really appreciate it. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for telling us where you are all from. I was actually recently in California for a couple of days, and I escaped the East Coast heat wave and then came back to normal summer weather. So I'm feeling very good. A little bit more about myself. Previous to Velocity, I was at McKinsey as a capability building consultant. And then prior to that, I was Harvard Business Publishing, which is an affiliate of the Harvard Business School, where I worked on kind of leadership development in virtual programs. So been doing this for a while and really excited to talk about this today. And very excited to be joined by my colleague, Dave.
Thanks, Diamond. Yeah, it's great to be here. Just a little bit about me. My career spans about 30 years. It's been in corporate, it's been in operations. I've been at large institutions like General Electric and JP Morgan Chase. And I've also been in institutions like higher education. So my career really spans, it's really about breadth for me, not just focused on one industry, for instance. And so I'm very happy to be here. And I have been through some restructuring. I'm sure, Diamond and I both have been through restructuring in our careers. And this is great material to talk about and get it out to you.
All right, fantastic. So let's jump into this a bit. So just would love to hear from all of you. When you hear the term company restructure, what does that mean? Anyone, go ahead and put that into chat. Would love to just get your understanding of what does that mean, company restructure? Abby, layoffs. Yep, that's typically what people hear. Anyone else, you hear company restructure, what does that mean to you? Layoffs, thank you, Ro. Barbara, change. Marie, change. Stephanie, change. Oh, yeah. Okay. Fantastic change. Okay. So when we are talking about company restructures, generally, realign resources. Thank you, Michelle. Organizational change, adapting to the market. All makes sense. Generally, we think of a company restructure as a broad term for reorganizing a company's operations, which can include changes to the organizational structure, management, or financial strategies. With that being said, when we hear company restructure, typically our brains goes to, oh, people are getting laid off. We think of job loss. We think of shift in reporting lines, and we think of just big operational change, which are all things that can feel very destabilizing. Anyone else? Another question for you guys. Why? Why do companies undergo restructure? I know I don't think they're intentionally trying to make people uncomfortable or they're not super excited for the possibility of job loss, but companies undergo restructures. Why do we think that happens? What are they trying to do? And I think some of you guys threw out there. So Michelle, realigning resources, you made that point earlier. That could possibly be why someone, revenue changes. Thomas, in order to be agile with the current climate, adapting and innovative. Maybe there is a change in focus. Thank you, Stephanie. Amanda threw out operational efficiency. Absolutely. All of these totally make sense. So the why here, they might be working towards a leaner organization. They might want to become more efficient, better organized, better focus on core business with a revised strategy or financial plan. We actually had the pleasure at Velocity of working with an organization that right before COVID hit, they made the transition from commercial properties to residential properties. And they brought in Velocity to help them support that change. And now you might think, well, it's still buildings, it's still property. That's not that much, but it actually was. It's a complete refocus on their business strategy. Totally different. How you work with people living, families in buildings, completely different to a commercial property where someone is renting a space to have a storefront or some kind of business. So that was a major company restructure where there were no layoffs. They didn't get rid of anyone, but they had to completely refocus what everyone in the organization did. So that's an example of a big company restructure where there was no layoffs, but they completely revised their strategy and their financial plan. So with that, can move into, so with that in mind, and we all kind of threw out layoffs and change, when we think about companies that have restructured, and we may all have experienced this, what can happen if a company is not restructured effectively? And I want us to really think about the mindset of restructures happen. There's all these reasons why they're done. And we might not like that we move from one team or the other. But there's all this other context about how you might do that effectively. Make sure people understand what's going on. What are the risks if a company doesn't really take that into consideration? All right, so we have morale. We have disengagement, misalignment. Absolutely. A lot of these things can happen. We can lose high performers. Absolutely. It can impact profit and employee engagement 100%. Miscommunication, morality, resistance to organizational change, shock to the culture, absolutely. So when we think about leadership, if your leadership is not intentional about how a restructure is designed and implemented, you guys all hit the big ones. Employee morale, engagement, and psych safety can all be negatively impacted. And you can end up in a really vicious cycle. People are uncertain. They lose trust in the organization. They suffer from survivor's guilt, which we'll jump into a bit deeper on an upcoming slide. They can become heavily disengaged, and then everyone is just operating out of fear. And once they hit that fear, they're just going to keep on being trapped in this cycle. So we have to be really mindful about what can happen to employees. And we're really focused here in this conversation of something has happened. There's been a restructure. There's been layoffs. I'm still here. I didn't lose my job. Maybe I'm in a different department. Maybe I have a different role, but I'm actually still here. And I'm actually still undergoing all of these issues. And that basically what happens here is this idea, if we look at survivor's guilt, often leadership can think, well, this person still has their job. They might be in a different department. They might have a different leader, but everything is fine, right? Why would there be any issue? You're still here. They're expecting people to be grateful that they're still there. But survivor's guilt carries so much heavy emotion. People are dealing with guilt and confusion, distrust. It can actually feel like the psychological contract between employee and employer has been broken. I showed up, I did my job, I did all the things you asked of me. And it could be that this restructure, it has nothing to do with performance, but I showed up and I performed very strongly and I did well, and I'm still being punished. So that contract that exists in our head between employer and employee, it feels completely broken. It feels totally disrupted. And now you're stuck in this cycle. And so one thing, again, I want to reiterate that we're really focused on employee experience. We're really focused on people who are still within the organization after some kind of restructure happens. But what I want to just note is that when these things occur, and if there are layoffs and people do leave the organization, the people that are still there, they are a witness to how that was handled. They're going to remember, hey, I saw what happened. I didn't get let go. I didn't get laid off, but I witnessed it. Maybe my best friend, at the company got laid off, someone that I know very well, maybe my manager, maybe several members of my team are actually no longer here. So I might not have been let go, but I have all this residual feelings about still being here while they're not. I might be full of uncertainty and fear about the future, but I also saw something. And if I don't think that was handled well or handled correctly, that's going to stay with me. And I'm going to be on high alert for that to happen in the future. And there's a lot of business outcomes when we just think about how things can affect, employee experience and then can affect engagement. Some of the business outcomes, and Dave is going to really dive into this. We can see lower productivity. We can see poor customer service, lower revenue, increased absences, lack of team collaboration. We can see a lot of things will happen when we get hit with that. If we consider employee experience, the sum total of all of our experiences within an organization, part of employee experiences is what happens before, during, and after some kind of restructure or change. Now, I particularly really love this topic because I've had the experience of being in an organization where I think I went through 3 or 4 big restructures. And the first 2 or 3, I remember I was still on the same team, but things kept shifting. And by the third one, I remember thinking, this is so stupid. What are we doing? So I eventually just stopped really caring. They threw out restructure and I was like, this is nonsense. We were regionally aligned, and then we were aligned by clients, and then they went back to regional alignment, and none of it actually mattered that much in the long run because everything eventually went back to status quo. So I really stopped caring. But in that same organization, I remember having a massive organizational restructure, and my manager called me about 10 minutes before they were going to announce to the whole organization. And she said, hey, just letting you know, they are getting rid of 2 roles. I will no longer be your manager. They're shifting how everyone is restructured. They're going to announce that in 10 minutes. I'm just giving you a heads up. And she actually did that because I was a high performer on the team. And even though I was still going to be generally doing the same work, but just being a different part of the organization, I burst into tears on that phone call because I actually went through like a grieving process. And it was in that moment, I was shocked. I was like, why am I crying? She was not, however. She kind of understood. She said, I called you because I knew this was going to really have an effect on you. But that was a restructure that led to me ultimately leaving that organization, even though I was still generally doing the same kind of work. It was just a restructure had come in such a way and it was handled so ineffectively that I could never become comfortable with the new normal of the organization. And I've also gone through a restructure that did ultimately lead to a layoff where I was laid off at a company after basically a week or 2 after I'd been given a phenomenal performance feedback. And remember being totally blindsided, shocked, completely had no idea. I was like, what is going on? Which is also not a great feeling either, but definitely have been on both sides. Dave, have you ever, I think we've chatted about you having gone through restructures and layoffs.
Yeah, some good, some not so good. The earliest one I remember was a large bank wanted to get into the mortgage business, and I was working at a small mortgage lender in Delaware, and so they wanted us because they needed a federal charter so that they can lend in every state, and we had that. So great, we merged. They brought us to a high-rise hotel, celebrating, gave us some swag. Really great stuff. 2 weeks later, we were told, yeah, we don't need your department, your team, your branch. and they let us go. So that was kind of a shock and kind of disheartening. Just a follow-up. That same company went bad in they went out of business in 2008. So karma, right?
Things happen. Yeah.
And
all right.
then on the other side is similar fashion, Diamond. I was a high performer at a company in Ohio, but we were in the credit card business. And in 2008, there were a lot of losses being incurred by a lot of companies, including this company. It was in October where I was told that, oh, the next year's forecast of losses was about $200 million. By the time they did a layoff in November, 1 month later, that forecast increased from 200 million to 1.2 billion. So that accelerated very fast. They had to do layoffs. They were very professional about it, gave us plenty of notice. In fact, I even got my yearly bonus despite that. So I thought they handled it very well, communication-wise, as well as process.
Fantastic. Well, obviously, we're talking about how this affects employee experience, but then this will also hit at our business outcomes. And Dave and I have our experience working as professionals in this industry, but also as people who have undergone and kind of been witness to these different experiences. But we also wanted to bring in some context from the larger landscape of what are people feeling, some data that we can bring in. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave to talk a little bit more about what we're seeing out there in terms of restructuring.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about it, you think about, do you know somebody that was laid off? No, actually, I don't have to look that deep. I actually know I am one of 3, for instance, that have been laid off at some point in my career, not because of cause, but for other reasons like restructuring. So it does happen. And in fact, 1 in 6 say it has happened in the past 3 months. Now, why is that so alarming, that 1 in 6? It could be attributed to AI, right? A lot of companies are rethinking how AI handles customer service, for instance, and so that number will increase. So it could be that. It also could be that there's a refocus on the dynamics of inclusion in the workplace. Maybe it's less of a priority, and there were roles that were dedicated to just that. They've since been laid off through restructuring. So it does happen. And I think that 1 in 3, that sounds like a fair number. I don't think it's anything more than that, but 1 in 3 is still a pretty good number. As far as job searches, 3 in 5, almost 60% are actually more likely to look for a new job when a restructuring happens. Even if they're not affected, they're going to look. Why? Because they think they're on a sinking ship. And a lot of times they're not. But it doesn't matter. Perception is everything, especially individual perception. So if I feel like, you know what, I don't like where this is going, I don't like change, I'm going to start looking for a job. Maybe it's just putting feelers out, but it's still looking for a new job. It's a little disruptive to one's performance at work potentially, and career. So it can be jarring a little bit. The next one, the why, right? More than half of employees said they don't understand why layoffs happening. Now, what is that a reflection of? Poor communication, poor transparency. In past generations, the boomers, my generation, which is Gen X, I am dating myself, but these generations didn't really care. The fact is, I was laid off. So move on. Let's move on. Newer generations, newer cohorts are more interested in the why. They want to know why it's happening. And I think this is actually very helpful because they can understand the why currently, but if it happens again, they understand already why it's happening, or at least there's good reason for why it's happening. And then the last one is 2 in 7, almost, what was that, about 20%, almost 29%, are not prepared if layoffs are happening. Again, this is a reflection of me thinking that it's always going to be 72 and beautiful. The climate is, the atmosphere is beautiful in here, when in fact change happens a lot. So I'm not prepared for change, or poor communication, poor transparency from leadership above. Not necessarily about, hey, layoffs now. It's more like, this is our performance leading up to this point, and this is why we're restructuring.
Absolutely. I think what I find really interesting is the 2 in 7 employees not being prepared if layoffs happen, being completely surprised. Even in terms of like a restructuring and an announcement, we are going to talk about how there's only so much information you can share. We can be transparent up until a point. But if you are completely blindsided, even if, and I think that statistic is, 2 in 7 employers not prepared. I think the idea is they're surprised by it happening. Not even necessarily that they are the ones that are laid off. It's just shocking. Like, where is this coming from? It does raise the question of, is it normal to be so out of the loop that you find out that, oh, things are actually not going well, and it's a shock to you? And what is the level of employee that should be privy enough to go like, things are not going well. I'm aware of that. Maybe there's a plan in place, but what is the level of preparedness, or how much someone should understand about the financial situation of an organization? I think that's a really interesting question that I think senior leadership and HR leadership should really take into consideration. What is the level of information that people should have? Is it okay if someone is like, wait, we're not doing well, to have that moment essentially?
And I'll add to that, Diamond. As an individual contributor in most companies, they care about how they do. They don't think about the bigger picture.
Right.
And having that perspective really will prepare you, even indirectly or subtly. It'll definitely help prepare you, because it won't be a surprise as much.
Absolutely. Okay. All right.
So at Velocity, we actually have a case study where a client was experiencing 2 straight quarters of below average performance, as far as in terms of stock performance, as well as financial factors. And so this actually happened recently. So what we did was we did a survey back in early Q4 of 2024. And we just did a pulse survey. A pulse survey is like a subset of a larger survey, an annual survey typically. And it just gives an idea or a snapshot on some things that are important to an organization. So this is almost like the pre-survey before the event happened, because in 2025, we were planning to launch an annual survey, the broader one, in late Q1. And we were asked to delay it about 60 days to Q2 because of a restructuring or a reduction in force. Now, when we look at this reduction in force, or a RIF, what we look at is that if you look at the overall organization, only 5% were affected. Yeah, that's true. But if you look at the teams that were affected, 10% of their team members were affected. So 1 in 10, that's a pretty large group, especially when you have teams that are more than 10. You're going to lose somebody. So the survey was then conducted still 60 days after that fact. So it's great because we have a nice pre and post event survey or snapshot. And what we looked at was, we looked at the teams that were impacted. On the right here, you see a table. We see teams that were impacted and how they did on certain questions or metrics. And then how did it compare to those teams that weren't impacted? So we look at engagement. All right, it's about 8 points lower than what you see in non-impacted teams. Impacted teams kind of took a hit there, right? And I think that there's a little bit more negative sentiment on these teams that were impacted, right? Because we're talking about members of my team that I'm close with, and that really hurt me a lot more than if I was not on that impacted team, but I knew of that department. I knew of the people that were affected. So it doesn't hit me as much. But if we look at overall satisfaction, recommending that company, you see how all these metrics are suboptimal compared to the non-impacted teams. Now, why do we really care about this, right? What's important about engagement? Engagement is critical, not only for business outcomes, and I think that's the end state. It also affects employee outcomes, such as employee satisfaction, overall satisfaction. It affects customer outcomes. Why would that be important? Well, because if I'm an employee and I'm on an impacted team, what's my tone when interacting with a customer? Maybe it comes across as curt, a little sharp, maybe a little negative even. And so that affects now customer satisfaction, NPS scores that we're talking about. And that is all, both of those are affecting business outcomes. And we're talking about bottom line, profitability, all the metrics that really talk about what makes a business stay in business, but is also profitable at the same time. That's why engagement is so critical. So when we see a gap like this, it's very concerning. And you wonder, could something have been done here to actually mitigate those negative numbers that we see on the impacted teams? Now, I will say this. These numbers on the right-hand side, the non-impacted teams, well, they're much better. Yeah, but they could even be better. There might be some survivor guilt or some survivor syndrome going on here where it's a little bit less negative, but it's still negative as far as sentiment goes. And their numbers are also driving the overall results down for an organization. So very important as far as engagement is concerned.
Fantastic. And I love this case study because I do appreciate we have this kind of pre and post data, and that we're also able to compare impacted teams versus non-impacted teams. And we can really see the difference here. And I think you make a great point that even the non-impacted teams, again, they are a witness to everything that has happened, and they are still going to feel the effects of any sort of restructure, because even though their teams may not have been impacted, there can be that fear, there can still be that uncertainty of, could this happen to us ultimately? That personal experience of, oh boy, anyone can be up next, really. I see we have a question here in the chat, and we'll hit that when we get to our Q&A section at the end, but that's a great question. All right, so with that, I would then ask, if thinking of a practical side of what we can do with this information, does anyone have examples of what they would imagine are common leadership missteps when we think about transitions and restructures? Anything come to mind of like, yep, been through that, experienced that? Common leadership missteps in transitions or restructures, and go ahead and put that in chat. All right, Karen, we have lack of communication. Definitely. Communication is a big one. Okay, and now, all right, not properly integrating the two companies' cultures. If there's an M&A, fantastic. Again, Amanda, only leadership knows what's going on. Barbara, communication is not timely. Communication is a big one. Grace, making broad statements without explaining the why. Balancing, waiting to have all of the information or being transparent sooner than later, but without all the details. Fantastic examples here. One thing I want to throw out, and Dave, back me up if you believe in this, but we do a lot of employee experience surveys at Velocity. And the two big ones that we always see with employee experience surveys is communication, never a great score. Employees always feel like there's something going on with communication. And then lack of trust in leadership, really low scores when we think about leadership within an organization. So if you imagine how important leadership and communication is when you're going through a transition and restructure, the challenge there is so much more magnified, because that's already where people have so much frustration already with any company. Even if the company's doing well, typically that's where we see our lowest scores.
No, that's a great point. You figured, they're already low or lower relative to all other categories. And then you have a restructuring. Good luck getting those numbers back up in a quick fashion. For sure.
Absolutely. So with that, I think you guys hit them around, a lot of them, but some common leadership missteps we see with transitions and restructure. So no structure around the actual announcement. So when it's going to happen. I've worked with organizations before where it was an email was sent out and they thought everything was going to be okay. And the reaction has been so strong from employees, nothing that they could have ever expected. But there was no structure around the announcement. There was no thinking of, how are people going to be affected by this? And how do we set up the organization that we can quickly address these issues? So typically no structure. I can often see this when we have leadership making decisions without working very closely hand in hand with HR. So it's typically the leadership has decided something, maybe your executive team. HR has not really been brought in as a strategic partner. And so there is an announcement of something, but there's no structure in terms of where do people go to if they have questions? Do we have a place where they can actually read the information? Has there been a town hall? Are you using different modalities of communication? Typically, when that happens and there's no structure, all you're going to end up having is people just making up information in place of the truth. And so we often talk at Velocity about this idea of the ladder of inference. And typically that means that as we climb up the ladder of inference and we're making assumptions and decisions about things when we don't have any information, we're going to pull information from previous experiences to fill in those gaps. And typically the information that we pull is negative. And so now what could have been handled better, it's largely negative and it's permeating the organization because there was no real structure. There wasn't a place people knew where to go, right? Another element we see here is middle managers not being empowered. Also something we see a lot on our employee experience surveys, low trust in leadership, high trust in direct supervisors and managers.
Oh, yeah.
The people that are going to be stuck in the middle here are your middle managers, and they're going to have to translate whatever is the big organizational restructure they're going to have to translate that typically to your individual contributors, people at lower levels. So you need to, so if they're not empowered and they don't have information, everyone's going to be going to them and they're not going to be armed and be ready to actually answer any questions. We're actually finding that middle managers are being very emotionally taxed based on data from 2024 in terms of feeling the pressure from the top of all the change that's happening, but at the same time, not being able to really answer the questions of the people that report into them. So them not being empowered, it's really, really difficult for them to be that bridge between senior leadership and your lower levels, more individual contributors. Ignoring change fatigue. Now, one thing that we talk about a lot at Velocity is that change is hard and change is personal. And so how Dave Schlosser might react to change and how I will react to change could be completely different. And so he might very quickly be like, great, new change, I'm going to move on. It might take me a while to get comfortable with what has happened. And it's just a purely personal experience. What can happen with change fatigue is that people are undergoing so much stress on the system of the organization that they can become disruptive. They can become apathetic. They can decide, they can just opt out. We call it exiting, where they say, I don't care. I'm just going to do what I was doing already. Change fatigue can become very real. I mentioned at a previous organization, I think I went through 3 or 4 restructures. By the third one, I didn't care anymore. It didn't matter because I thought eventually we're just going to go back to what we did before. And so when we had that 4th restructure where things really did change and it was a significant impact on my career, I was flabbergasted. I could not believe what was going on. And so back to business, potentially too fast or too slow. We'll dive deeper into that in another slide, but it can become a real question of, hey, we are doing this we're doing this big change, and we're just expecting you to be like, but get back to work. Nothing has changed. Everything's fine, even though everything's changed. Or, hey, let's live in limbo for a really long time. That can also be incredibly challenging for people. And then the last one on here that I have is overlooking survivor's guilt. So as I mentioned, people who retain their jobs, they can feel a sense of guilt, anxiety, uncertainty about their continued employment following the departure of some of their colleagues. And so some symptoms are guilt and shame. Why was I spared? Anxiety and fear about their job security, about potential layoffs, decreased trust. Well, how can I trust anything that's going to happen here? We've broken that psychological contract between employer and employee. Resentment can happen where it's like, why is this happening? I'm very, very unhappy. And then also increased workload. So now if you're making something leaner, tighter, you could potentially have someone taking on a lot more work than they previously had. And this can then have an impact, decrease morale, reduce productivity. People are really struggling. They're not doing the job they used to. Increased turnover and potentially, and then, like I said, this erosion of trust in leadership is going to then hit engagement. And Dave Schlosser mentioned all the ways that can have effects on your business outcomes, your customers as well. In particular, I think when I think about this, overlooking survival's guilt and understanding, I think that a big piece when I look at that, as well as the structure and communication, people who make the decisions about ultimately, like, we need to have this restructure, or we need to have a reduction in force, a RIF, they have all the data, they have all the information. It makes total sense to them. And the idea that I'm going to announce this and nobody else needs any of that information, it can easily become, well, they still have a job. I don't know what the problem is. But if that happens when we don't recognize of how personal change can be and how that can affect people. And so I think when you lose that insight into people, their personal experiences, what can be going on in their personal life, how they're being affected at work, how that can disrupt psychological safety. I think it's an oversight that can happen at executive levels that is not due to callousness. It's just they have information that they don't realize. Without that information, people can't really understand why these decisions are being made. Okay, so these are some common leadership missteps and transitions and restructures. What are some best practices? What are things that we can do? And this is pre, during, and post. Does anyone have any suggestions or thoughts, or have they witnessed things that have eased transitions or restructuring? Some best practices in mind. We'll see if we get any in there. But there are definitely ways that we can handle this to make it an easier experience for people. And so some of these include, let me just get that. All right, so what can we do? So as I mentioned, we want to engage HR early and strategically. One of the really interesting trends I would say in 2024 and moving forward is switching from HR being a place of, they're just really functional based, they take care of payroll and those kinds of functions too. They are a strategic partner, and we need them as culture and communication partners. They have insight into employee sentiment. What are the talent risks? Who are the high performers that we actually want to keep here? And we also want to make sure that we are compliant. We're actually taking into consideration, are we following the rules here? So we want to engage them early and strategically. This is a pre-announcement role for HR. There needs to be a clear narrative that is shared as transparently as appropriate, right? So that really ties, Michelle, you mentioned clarify the why. That really ties into the why. What is the narrative? Are we all aligned on it? And one thing I will call out, your executive team, whatever senior team is spearheading these restructures, they also have to be clearly aligned. It becomes very obvious when not everyone at the top is actually aligned on what is going on. And that can lead to real issues within the organization. All right, so we want a clear narrative that is shared transparently. And then, like I mentioned before, you want to involve and equip your middle managers. I worked with a team that was getting ready to, announce a pretty big riff, and they weren't really involving their most senior HR person. And so my recommendation to her was make your plan and then just tell them the plan. Ask for forgiveness, not permission. And so she came up with a script for middle managers. She set up different times where people could actually join meetings and talk about their experiences. She worked with the CEO on what his script is. And so, she had even tried to get, they had a major location in another country. She was also even trying to get the members of the executive team in that other country in person to try to really make sure that people had someone to go to. And because she couldn't do that, she then instead had to say, okay, who's the most senior person in that other country, in that office? You're going to have to be that liaison. People are going to need to be able to come to you that day. Your office is open. You have an open office all day long where people can come in and talk to you, right? Provide a vision of the future. That's really tied into the why. I think people forget, we had this restructure. Why? One of our previous statistics that Dave shared was all about, people have no idea, what was the point of this layoff? What was the point of this restructure? I don't really have a vision of how this is going to make the organization better. So why should I buy in? People really need to have a vision. Acknowledge the emotional landscape. Again, this is the time for people to have a place to go and talk to. Part of this is why you need to involve and equip your middle managers. If I am the CTO, I probably don't have as much time to really let people sit in my office and talk to me. Maybe on that first day where the restructure is announced, I give that space. But ultimately, I'm going to have to trust that my middle management is going to have the ability to step in and support. And then in terms of So then we provide a vision of the future. We acknowledge the emotional landscape. We try to preserve that psych safety. We want to make sure that people are still feeling comfortable within the organization. We coordinate communication across all levels. Another big piece of involving and equipping your middle managers, and making sure that everyone has the same narrative and is talking to the same vision of the future. So one of the really interesting things about an experience that I had during a restructure where I was part of a layoff, the day that it occurred, I will never forget, we got an email in the morning that said, hey, if you have a meeting, you got to cancel it. And everyone was like, what are you talking about? I was like, I have client facing things. Like, I'm not doing that. And they're like, cancel everything. Yeah. And then my manager got invited to a meeting 30 minutes before, and everyone's calendars were on fire. And I just remember thinking, this could have been handled way better. This was managed very poorly. People were hopping into meetings, talking about like what's going on. Different teams got different announcements, even though we were all part of the same business unit. Very, very handled terribly. So you really want to think about, how do you coordinate communication across all levels? There are times when things can only be announced the day of. You can still think about, how do I make sure that communication is handled well? And then post announcement, as you're thinking about how do I get back to who we were, think about how you still coordinate communication so that people are getting information at relatively the same time.
Reinforce.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to add my own little story here because it reminded me when you talked about that. I had a layoff I was impacted by, and I got a 15-minute meeting invite to a room. When you look at the room in the hallway, the room was papered over, so you couldn't see who was in it. I'm like, oh, what's this about? We all know.
I wonder what this conversation is, right?
Yeah, right.
You want to reinforce cultural anchors, monitor pulse metrics, and act on feedback. There has to be a feedback loop. Again, this is part of why you're really equipping your middle managers. Dave, you shared a case study of a client, obviously employing employee experience surveys. They now have that data. We really see a decline has happened. And then they have the opportunity to act on that. And then celebrate small wins and moments of progress. If you can give people a vision of the future and everyone has the same narrative, then there should be clear times when we are able to see, hey, this is a win. Something has happened and now we are doing something better. So I think that is really, really important here. Part of the way that you celebrate the small wins is with the vision of the future. If I don't know what this is supposed to be, then how can I know when a win has happened, when we've had that moment of progress? So that is really an important piece of why we want that vision of the future. So these are all just best practices that we can consider pre, during, and post restructures. Now, I want to touch on this a bit more, and it's the question of when and how do you go back to normal, or what if even is normal after a restructure or potentially a reduction in force. I want to throw out that there's a real danger in staying in limbo too long or getting back to business too quickly. Getting back to business too quickly, it can feel like callousness. It can feel like we haven't really taken into consideration how people are feeling. We definitely want to take into consideration that something has happened, a change has occurred. The people that are still there, they might be mourning. We use this term of grief and mourning, and it might feel like hyperbole, but for the experience that people have when there is change, that is what it can feel like for people. I talked about crying on the phone when my people manager said, I'm not going to be your people manager anymore. She had been my people manager for almost 4 years. We had a very close personal relationship. And then the shift was devastating. They had also eliminated the 2 roles that were the next step in my career. Those were completely gone. In a single phone call, what I had envisioned myself a path for maybe the next 5 years was gone. So there was some pain there that happened. So it can feel very emotional, and getting back to business too quickly can feel super painful. Staying in limbo too long, also very dangerous. You need to kind of get to it. People eventually need to kind of recognize, okay, so here is the new normal. Here's what we're going to do now, ultimately. And I can recall, working with an organization where the limbo lasted so long and people had to straddle multiple roles for so long. And there was a new business unit was created that pulled people from different parts of the business. And so everyone else, while they were kind of getting up to speed and figuring out how they were going to do things, everyone else was taking on a lot more work. And eventually it became a question, this call of like, have grace, give them grace, give them grace. People stopped having grace for them. Eventually, if you have pulled them to do a new job, they need to do that job. And I have to stop having to do 2 or 3 other jobs. I would say in general, I think, there's also a danger of when we think about communication, when we think about when we announce things, I have a friend who works for a higher education institution, and they had their regular town hall. And at the end of the town hall, their leadership explained to them, like, by the way, there are potential layoffs coming in like the next 2 months. It's like 5 minutes left in the meeting. So everyone's like, what, can we get a little more context? And they're like, we don't have any, but just letting you know that could happen in the next 2 months. What do you think everyone is going to go back and sit at their desks and be like, I guess I'll just get back to business as usual. I'm feeling good and I feel motivated to do my job. No, that is an example of you've got to be prepared. And again, that's not having your announcement ready. It's not having a clear vision. We have to really think about when we announce things, the timing, because now everyone is in a state of panic for maybe 2 months, a month and a half, as opposed to really being careful about how quickly people can get back to what they were doing before and actually become part of a new normal. Oh, went too quickly. With all that is to say, thank you guys for joining us, and we'll hit some questions if anyone has it. I know we definitely have one, but we just want to call out that employee experience is strategic. It's not optional. Again, employee experience is the sum of all the interactions an employee has within an organization. And if, when something like this happens with restructuring or any of those transition or challenges, we really have to be mindful that can have a major hit on employee engagement. And then that can have a major hit on our business outcomes, our employee outcomes, and our customer outcomes, right? So if I were to sum up everything that we've talked about today, say what's hard, name what's hard. Change is hard, restructuring is hard, RIFs are hard. So we want to say that out loud. We want to acknowledge that. We also want to listen with care. Again, this is where our middle managers really come in handy, creating a feedback loop, making sure people are comfortable having a space to talk, listen with care. Rebuild culture through intention and not assumption. We like to use the phrase intentional culture at Velocity because culture is going to exist. You can have some control there if you are intentional about how you build that culture or the actions that you take. We don't want to just assume everyone is going to be fine. We don't want to just assume chaos is going to occur. We want to rebuild culture through intention. What are the actions we are going to take? What's the plan? How are we going to help people through this? And then we want to act with conviction, but be ready to pivot. If ultimately that decision has been made that this restructuring is going to lead to the best possible outcomes for the organization, then act with conviction. But the change journey is often not a straight line. A lot of things can happen where we might have to pivot, do something differently, start from scratch, and then go back up. So be ready to pivot when necessary and make changes, but with ultimately sticking true with, if I believe the end goal is where we need to be, I will do that. I will get there and I will act with conviction, but I will have the mindset of that straight line. It probably isn't going to happen. We're going to have to pivot along the way. So if I were to sum up everything, that would be our 4 big points.
And I'll add, Diamond,
with that, yeah, go ahead. Thanks, Dave.
That's okay. The last one is, I think people gloss over the act with conviction because they say, okay, I got to be ready to pivot. No, you got to be, everybody who's in the know managerially, this is not the time for weak knees. You have to act as one and with conviction, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, Abby, I think you're going to rejoin us.
Hello, I'm back.
Hi.
This was fantastic. And I think, Dave, when you gave the example of a layoff situation that was done the right way, it's refreshing to hear stories like that, because I think this topic is so popular because so often it's done the wrong way. And I don't think it's intentional. I think everyone's doing the best they can. It's just these situations, people don't know how to handle it. They don't have the tools. They don't have some of the ideas that you all have shared and best practices. or they just get the directive and then it happens and then they have to scramble. So this is great. I think there was a lot of great tips and a lot of great ideas here that hopefully our audience can use. We do have a couple of questions. So the first one that you all saw in the chat from Amanda, how would you work with the impacted teams to improve the scores before the next survey? And does this approach work for the whole company, or do you just focus on the impacted teams?
I have some thoughts there. Again, I would be interested in these impacted teams. If new people are on their teams, kind of how their managers have been equipped, I would definitely share the results with the managers of those teams and kind of say, hey, here's what we're seeing. I want you to have a dedicated dialogue with your team of what are we experiencing now? Do we have the resources that we need? Are we just feeling residual emotions about what's going on, or are there tactical changes or needs that we have from the organization? I think, Dave, you and I also talked about, that's the second survey was relatively close to the actual RIF happening. So perhaps with some time, emotionally, people will feel better. But I would definitely equip the managers of those teams with those scores and just have very honest, transparent conversations about how are we feeling and what do we need to get back to feeling like, we have the psychological safety, we believe in the vision. And then I think take the feedback to the senior leadership team and say, hey, here's what we need to know about the vision. Or, hey, here's the resources that we actually need. Or here are the challenges that we're facing. And I do think that with that being said, however, I would say that those conversations should be done with all teams, not just impacted teams. But I do think that it could be that the senior leadership does focus a bit more on those impacted teams, and maybe they come to those meetings and they offer more of an opportunity for people to speak directly to them. But I think those manager conversations should occur with all teams, not just impacted teams.
Yeah, totally agree with that. I think that you also need to equip the managers with a toolkit to help them navigate, because it's probably going to be a bit of a change for them as well. And how do they handle these stressors that are coming at them on a daily basis? So equipping them would really be helpful too.
Yeah. And if there are new people, even if the team, so let's say the team has lost some people, or maybe there are new people on those teams. When we think about the concept of psychological safety, I think that anytime you have something like this happen, psychological safety, it's going to be affected. So, some things that we encourage different teams to do to either, first get an assessment. How is the psychological safety feeling on the team? At Velocity, we have like a psychological safety wheel / assessment where people can take it anonymously. That has a bunch of different questions about, risk or feeling like you can speak up or be yourself. And so you use that first just to get a baseline of how people are feeling. And then from there, you can actually say, okay, so we have a few things we want to work on. Let's figure out what are the norms. How do we best work as a team? And then make some rules for ourselves that we revisit every 3, 6, 9 months. Are we actually living up to the standards and norms that we set for ourselves? And if not, what needs to change? So I think in these instances as well, I would encourage any impacted team in particular to reassess psychological safety and think about what needs to change. What are the new norms that we're going to have?
Cool. All right. Let's see, I've been trying to choose which one, trying to pick one of the 2 questions that we had before, that we talked about before.
We also have a question from Thomas, I think.
Oh, perfect. Sorry. All right, let's do that one. So do you think using pulse surveys or some other source of assessment can help with keeping the communication fresh within an organization during an organizational restructure?
I would say yes. In any instance, communication needs to be fresh, whether it's a restructuring or not, because we see, we discussed very high level, that communication and trust and leadership kind of suffers in a lot of organizations, but particularly around restructuring. I think keeping it fresh and assessing communication, especially at the senior leadership level, is quite important and a good idea.
I also am a big believer I'm a big believer in monthly or quarterly town halls. I really think that getting everyone together is so important in an organization, because silos, and we hear a lot about silos on employee experience surveys. We hear a lot about, I don't know what, the arm and the leg, don't know what they're both doing. But what I also really love is, I think after that, you can have a post town hall poll or survey where we can actually say like, hey, was this useful? What information do you still need help on? Did we hit all your questions? I always found that the data from those were very helpful. And even like the quick turnaround time of sending in a post town hall communication where it's like, hey, these were the questions that you guys called out that you still need help with. I'm going to go ahead and answer that in an email, or we'll work on getting you a response to that. So I think it's really important. Now there is over surveying, which I think people can feel really frustrated by, but that's why from a velocity perspective, we think one big organizational survey a year, maybe a pulse survey to hit some things you want to work on, but keep it really light in terms of that post town hall poll or survey. Not too many questions, maybe 1 to 3, really just focused on like, what do you need? What information don't you have? So it's very practical and it can immediately help people.
Great. All right. So we only have a couple more minutes, but touching on that question, obviously once the restructuring is initially announced, everyone's shocked. It's very obvious that people are shocked, but ongoing, before it shows up in engagement data, what are some signs that restructuring has affected the employees, like whether their trust or morale or those sorts of things?
One organization I worked with, there were a couple of resignations within a few days. So, you get hit with resignations. I think, again, middle managers are a good place to go. They might get a ton of emails or communication, and they have no way to potentially answer it. And so they're looking for support. I think that's another key sign. I think another big one might be apathy. I think if you're getting a lot of apathy from people where, I worked with a client where they sent out an email and they're like, I'm really surprised I haven't heard anything. And I'm like, that's because people are completely apathetic. They don't care at all because you've done this so many times. It doesn't mean anything to them. So I think those are a couple things I've noticed with organizations. I don't know, Dave, anything you would add?
No, those are great ones actually. But no, it's really, it's at the end of the day, it's about controlling information and just realize that things are going to get out. So for instance, an organization's big enough, they don't want this getting out to the media because then it might affect their stock price, which was what I had with an organization I worked for a while ago. It's going to get out. You just got to be prepared for when it gets out, contingency plan. When it gets out, this is our talking points. Refer all employees to talk to this spokesperson for the organization. From an organization standpoint, I think that's important.
Yep, that's a great point. It's going to happen. Be as prepared as you can. Yeah. People are going to be upset. Own it. Yep.
Absolutely. People are going to be upset. I think something else to remember too is when you consider the practice of change management, one of the really important principles is that no matter what, the outcome could be the greatest thing ever. The period of transition, as people are going through a big change, you're going to have decreased productivity. That is just basic change management science. It's how quickly you can get out of that, and lower engagement from employees is going to make that last longer. So doing everything you can to keep that engagement high and being mindful of employee experience can only help you get to that outcome as quickly as possible. The good outcome that you're looking for as a result of this restructure.
Yep. Good reminder. All right. Well, that's it. We're taking it straight up to the top of the hour. Thank you for everyone who was able to join us. If you're watching this on replay, we also appreciate you sitting in and listening to our webinar about employee experience during organizational restructures. So if you want more information about Velocity, it's www.velocityadvisorygroup.com. Or you can email Diamond, dlewis@velocityadvisorygroup.com. But yeah, thank you. Everybody have a great, it's Friday. Have a great weekend. And we'll see you all next time. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.